You're listening to Secrets of the Royals, a podcast about the tragedies that befell the royal family. And we're your hosts, journalists and royal experts, Kerry and Maria. Hello and welcome back to the Secrets of the Royals with me, Kerry.
And me, Maria.
We're two journalists and old friends.
Very old friends.
Who've worked for many years on newspapers and magazines, and we share a passion for royal content. So together we edit the Royal List newsletter over on Substack. We'd love you to join us there.
Yeah, please do.
So today we're going to talk about the heartbreaking tales of Prince Philip's tragic female relatives. Now, Maria's done an enormous amount of research on this.
It was quite head-spinning in that there's so much tragedy involved in this family and so many amazing stories that we couldn't possibly, I don't think, do it justice right now.
No, so we've picked out some of the stories that we thought we'd share today. We might have to revisit in the future. As a bit of background, Prince Philip was born Prince Philip of Denmark and Greece, famously on the kitchen table in Corfu, wasn't he?
Yeah, June 1921.
Yeah.
And he was, in fact, he had more blue blood flowing through his veins than his wife, Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah, so connected to all the royal families in all the
most of the
dynasties
in Europe at that time.
But what came with that is a very, very dysfunctional childhood, because as we'll reveal later, he pretty much had a solo childhood, brought up on his own in the UK.
Yeah,
away from his family.
From about the age of 8, it all unravelled for him, and certain relatives had to step in.
Yeah, which probably explains some of his characteristics and why he was so resilient and put such a massive emphasis on sort of being self-sufficient.
Yes, a very
getting on with it.
Yeah, just getting on with things and not one for sort of ruminating on what might have been.
No. So the most famous story connected to Prince Philip, with anybody that watched The Crown would remember in its early episodes, was the death of his sister Cecily. So do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah. So Princess Cecily was his favourite sister. He had 4 sisters. So he was obviously the much yearned for heir after four daughters were born to his mother, Princess Alice, and his dad, Prince Andrew. And so he had sisters Margarita, Theodora, Cecily, and Sophie. So Cecily was 10 years older than him, and she married a Grand Duke of Hessen by Rhine in 1931. He was called George, and she was very young. And by the age of 26, she was pregnant with her 4th child. So it was during this time in 1937, November 1937, the family were travelling back to the UK, back to London, because her husband's brother, he's called Prince Louis, was getting married. So they were travelling back for a family wedding. And unfortunately, she was 8 months pregnant at the time, and they were travelling by night. It was foggy, the visibility was bad. The plane hit a chimney smokestack of a big factory in Belgium, and it came crashing down just on the outskirts of Ostend on that night, killing everyone on board. And on board was herself, her husband, 2 of her small children, 2 boys, 4 and 6, Prince Ludwig and Alexander, and her mother-in-law as well. They were all killed. But what was really heartbreaking about this story was the fact that in the wreckage, they'd found a newborn baby boy next to Cecily. She'd obviously, at 8 months pregnant, had gone into labour during the flight.
So that's why they tried to make the emergency landing.
Yeah, that would explain, why the pilot was trying to make an emergency landing, why it gone so horribly wrong with such tragic circumstances. And another cruel twist to this story, there was one child that wasn't on the plane, a little girl called Joanna, and she was only 10 months old at the time. So obviously this is Philip's niece. So she was adopted and brought up by Prince Louis, the brother that they were going to see get married. But again, tragically, Joanna died 18 months later, meningitis, in 1939. So all in all, just an awful, awful tale, really. And no wonder Philip was devastated.
So he went to the funeral, didn't he?
Yeah, so again, yes, he had to go to Darmstadt, which is their ancestral home of these Grand Dukes, just near Frankfurt. And he went to the funeral. By then, the Nazis had occupied that part of Germany, so it wasn't unusual to see Nazi paraphernalia everywhere. His sisters had all married German princes who had joined the party, and he had to walk behind his sister's funeral with his brother-in-law, who was clad in an SS uniform. So, yes, but, that at the time, that was what was happening. Yeah,
It's interesting to wonder how he dealt with that really over the years, with his sisters marrying, because he would have loved his sisters, but had married Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. I know. And obviously, they weren't invited to the wedding because of that.
No. 47. It would be terrible optics. Terrible.
Yeah.
So we talked about his when he was born, and his mother was Princess Alice. Now, again, the only thing people might know about Princess Alice, they might have seen it on The Crown, or and think, oh yes, wasn't she something to do with being a nun? So do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so she did actually sort of established her own sisterhood in 1949. She'd spent the war years in Greece, and she'd helped in the Red Cross, and she'd actually protected some Jewish refugees. So the Cohen family, it was a mother and two sons. But she decided in 1949 she was going to create the sisterhood. I think it was called of Martha and Mary.
Yes.
And they had their own nuns' uniforms, of course. So if you look at photographs, actually, of the coronation of the Queen, of her daughter, you'll see a nun in the pictures, and that's his mother. Yeah. So at the time, though, her own mother was still alive, who was Princess Victoria, Philip's grandmother, and she was laughing. She would roll her eyes sometimes at Alice and just say, what kind of nun smokes and plays canasta? Because obviously she was quite an unconventional nun, shall we say.
But if we go back a bit further...
Yes, but there's more to her, yes.
A horrible treatment of her medically.
Yes, yeah. And also the fact that she was very religious and had a very deep faith was partly driven by what she'd been through during the late 1920s, 1930s. She was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic in 1930 and committed to an asylum in Switzerland, treated brutally with whatever medical treatment they thought was great at that time. And I think at one point Sigmund Freud was advising on her treatment and advised them to x-ray her ovaries to bring on an early menopause.
Yeah, because it was libidinous hysteria or something.
Yeah, so it's just...
She's really, I mean, we're only 100 years on that, but any problem with a woman mentally has to be to do with her libido. I mean, it's so unbelievably tragic. There's poor people at that time treated, and including her.
Yeah, and the whole time she was there for almost 3 years. She did eventually was allowed to leave in early 1933, but by then, Philip had not. I think he was brought there once, but they've all found it too upsetting. So he didn't see his mother until his sister's funeral. So he didn't see his mother for 5 years, and she had no contact. She travelled around Europe and just kept in touch with her mother, Princess Victoria, but developed a deep faith. So and eventually settled in Greece in 1938, where she did all that great work through the war when the Nazis had occupied it. Yeah. So a fascinating story. And also now she's buried in Israel, which was one of her dying wishes, because she was honoured as righteous among nations, because she was a non-Jew that at great risk to her own life saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust. And also I forgot to mention, she was born congenitally deaf.
Yes,
and her mother taught her to lip read and speak in German and English, I believe. So amazing woman. Yeah, and she did die in Buckingham Palace. So she spent the last couple of years with Philip. Yeah. So they were reunited towards the end, which was nice.
Thank you to our hotel partner, the Soho Hotel, where we recorded this episode. In the heart of London's Soho, this gorgeous hotel is a favourite destination of Kerry's. Book at ferndalehotels.com. Moving on, now we're moving on to the short, sad life of another Princess Alice, who was Philip's great-grandmother.
Yeah,
what do you know about her?
I think we all have to keep up. There's a lot.
Yeah.
Should have a flip to the family tree. Yeah. So Yes, Philip's mum was obviously named after his great-grandmother, Princess Alice. So she was the second daughter of Queen Victoria, and she married a Grand Duke of Hesse by Rhine, who appears, in that other story. And at the age of 20, she went over to live in Germany. And by the time she was 35, though, she died of diphtheria really quite suddenly. She was ill, and then she was dead within a couple of weeks. So what had happened in 1878, the household had just had an outbreak of it. It affected all her children. She had 5 surviving children, and she was a great friend and a great admirer of Florence Nightingale. So she decided she was going to nurse her own children back to health, which I think at the time was quite unusual. But unfortunately, she lost her youngest daughter, Princess Marie, and she caught the disease herself. And that was quite sad as well, because that was because she was comforting her youngest son.
Yeah.
And then caught it. And within a matter of weeks, she died on December the 14th, which, spookily, was her father's own death day as well.
Right.
Many years before, in 1861. And she'd also nursed him on his deathbed.
Oh, right.
I know, so it's really weird. And apparently her final words were, "Dear Papa." And then she passed away.
Oh.
So, yes, it was awful. An awful tale, really.
Yeah. Now, we are now moving on to a particularly gruesome part of this podcast, which is the fate of Philip's doomed great aunt.
Yes.
So,
So what the lady that just died of diphtheria, Princess Alice.
Yeah.
She obviously gave birth to Philip's grandmother, Princess Victoria, and she also had 2 other daughters that married into the Russian imperial family, into the Romanovs, which we all know what happened to them by the time of 1918. So they were Princess Elizabeth and Princess Alex, and one of them, Princess Elizabeth, became a Grand Duchess, and the other one became the last Tsarina of Russia. So, but they were both killed by the Bolsheviks within 24 hours of each other in July 1918. So, well, the first to go was the Tsarina and her family. They were all executed by firing squad in the basement of a house over in eastern Russia. Yeah, a really grisly tale there, because she had 5 beautiful children. There's her and her husband, Nicholas II. He was the Tsar. And they were all brought down in the middle of the night, believing that they were going to be moved to another location. And this was the 17th of July, 1918. They were lined up in the basement, then told that they were being executed. Immediately, firing squad shot the Tsar dead in the chest. Then I believe the Tsarina was shot in the head. Alexei, the young boy, was killed. And awful. All the girls, there were 4 daughters. There was old Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Beneath their dresses, they had all the family jewels sewn into their undergarments. So the bullets were flying off them. And they weren't, obviously, when they'd just seen their family, being massacred, and they knew they were going to die. But so the soldiers didn't understand why this was happening, and then they pulled out their swords and they just started bayoneting them to death, and pretty grim. And apparently it took at least 20 minutes, and it was just really gruesome. So yes, that was the really tragic end to Philip's other side of the family, really. And later, gosh, was it
then what happened then the next day, though? How did the
the other sister, within 24 hours, she was thrown down a mine shaft with a few other Romanovs, and a few hand grenades were chucked down afterwards. They set it on fire, and according to eyewitness reports, they were singing hymns until eventually it just went silent, and obviously they died. So really terrible. Grim and gruesome end to that part of the family. And Philip, I think Philip eventually in the 90s, he donated some DNA.
That's right.
When they discovered some bodies, just to prove it was the imperial family. So, So finally, we have the heartbreak of
Princess Victoria, who was Philip's influential grandmother. Now, she had a massive impact on his life.
Yeah, she really did.
So,
yeah.
Do you want to explain who she was?
Yeah, well, as we mentioned, those sisters that were killed by the Bolsheviks were actually her younger sisters. So she eventually moved to Britain. She fell in love with a Prince Louis of Battenberg, who was based over in Britain as well. And she was very close to her grandmother, Queen Victoria. So, yeah, she decided that she saw her own daughter, Princess Alice, lose her mind and lose her family. So she stepped in, and at the age of 8, when, poor Philip was homeless, she stepped in and took charge of his upbringing and education. So, and by that time, obviously, I haven't even mentioned Philip's father. He never reconciled with his wife and died in 1944 after spending most of those years with his mistress.
On the Riviera.
Yeah, in Monte Carlo. Yes, yeah.
Okay, so they became the Mountbattens.
Yes, they had to change their name in 1917.
Yeah, so they became the Mountbattens, and this is now why Philip became
Philip Batten. Yes, that's right. That's right. So yeah, I didn't mention she had 4 children. So there was Prince George, Prince Louis, who became Lord Mountbatten.
Who we're going to talk about.
Yeah, obviously Princess Alice, that was Philip's mother. And there was another daughter, Princess Louise, that became the Queen of Sweden.
Yeah.
So, yes, she was an amazing woman. She was apparently Prince Louis said she was a walking encyclopedia.
Yeah.
She obviously, taught her daughter how to lip read and speak in German and English when Alice was born congenitally deaf. And yeah, she was a feisty woman.
Yeah, she was no nonsense. That's where he obviously got that.
Yes, yeah.
From. But happily, to end this podcast, she did live a long life, didn't she? Didn't she live?
Yeah, even though one of her sons died at the age of 45. Yeah, she did. She saw her own grandson, Philip, become, the husband of the future queen. And she was godmother to Prince Charles. So, yeah, she died in Kensington Palace after a very long life, even though she was a lifelong smoker. And Prince Philip said something very touching about her. And I'll just read it, I'll put my glasses on. He said, "I liked my grandmother very much, and she was always helpful. She was very good with children. She took the practical approach to them. She treated them in the right way, the right combination of the rational and the emotional." It's probably very much what he was like, I should think.
I like the right combination of the rational and emotional.
Yeah, she sounded very, very amazing woman.
Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, do share with your friends and subscribe to the Royal List newsletter over on Substack.
Oh my God, that was really nuts.